The guards had already taken Raina Akafer's data slate by the time the speaker called her name. She had been standing at the observer's rail for 6 minutes, waiting for the floor, and in that time the 2 assembly stewards flanking her had confiscated her slate, her stylus, and after a whispered exchange she wasn't meant to hear, the small enamel pin on her lapel shaped like a wheat stalk, a gift from her grandmother, on the grounds that unregistered insignia were not permitted past the rail during a plenary vote. Raina had let them take it. She had learned, in 14 months attached to the Earth Observer mission, that arguing with a steward accomplished nothing except giving the chamber something to watch while it waited for the real business to start. "The chair recognizes the human delegate," said Speaker Vantel Kaur, in the dry, carrying voice of a man who had never once in his political life needed to raise it. The Assembly's plenary hall was not built for intimacy. It was a vast tiered bowl 300 meters across, ringed 12 levels deep with delegate boxes, capped by a shallow glass dome through which the system's binary suns threw a flat, shadowless afternoon light across the marble floor. 941 worlds held seats in the Galactic Assembly. Most of them were watching the floor now, because the item on the agenda, Ratification Motion 2291, Formal Reprimand and Conditional Standing, Terran Observer Mission, was the first disciplinary action brought against a species in 6 years, and disciplinary actions were, without exception, the best-attended sessions of the term. Raina walked to the podium at the floor's center. It was a long walk. 941 delegations had a very long time to look at her. She was 30 years old. She had not asked to be the one standing here. The senior envoy, Director Okonkwo Baptiste, had been recalled to Geneva 11 days ago for consultations that had somehow stretched past the vote date, and the deputy had a stomach flu that everyone privately suspected was diplomatic in nature, and so the junior traded a with a folder of testimony, and a wheat stalk pin was who Earth had sent to answer for itself. She had spent those 11 days doing the job the way she had been trained to do it, which was thoroughly, and without assuming that thoroughness alone would be sufficient. She had requested and received sworn confirmation from 3 separate members of the Amara Vos S crew that the resupply run had been logged, corrected, and reported within regulation timeframes. She had cross-referenced Deputy Coordinator Hess's mediation request against the Assembly's own public shipping manifests, confirming that the relief convoy it described had, in fact, existed, and had, in fact, reached the Vantic refugee camps on schedule. She had drafted, revised, and drafted again a 2-page brief that reduced 8 months of procedural history into a document she believed any reasonable delegate could read in 90 seconds and understand completely. She had done, in short, everything a careful, well-trained junior diplomat could do to ensure that the facts of the matter were beyond honest dispute, and she had done it without yet understanding that the facts of the matter had never been the point at all. "Delegate Akafer," Speaker Kaur said, "you may respond to the findings before the chair moves to vote." The findings, as read into the record 40 minutes earlier by the Assembly's Compliance Directorate, were these: that the Terran Observer Mission had, in the course of a border dispute mediation 8 months prior, deployed unregistered military assets, a single frigate, the TFS Amara Vos on a resupply run that had strayed, by the Directorate's own admission, 400 kilometers inside a contested exclusion zone, and that this constituted, under Assembly Statute 14, a material breach of observer conduct, warranting formal reprimand, and a downgrade of Earth's mission status from provisional observer to monitored petitioner. The lowest tier the Assembly recognized short of expulsion. Raina had read the findings. She had also read the flight logs, the mediation transcripts, and the sensor data, all of which she had spent 11 days compiling into a folder that the stewards had just taken from her hands. "I'd like the floor to note," she said, that the frigate in question was operating under an explicit request from this Assembly's own mediation office, filed by Deputy Coordinator Hess 3 days before the incident, asking for logistical support to the relief convoy serving the Vantic refugee camps inside that same zone. I have the request. I have the timestamp. I would like it entered into the record before the chair moves to vote. There was a pause. Somewhere above her in the tiers, someone laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, quickly muffled. Speaker Core did not look at his data display. The chair has reviewed the submitted materials, he said. The Compliance Directorate's findings stand as read. Deputy Coordinator Hess's request, if it exists, does not appear in this Assembly's official correspondence log and cannot be entered as evidence. It exists, Raina said. I have the transmission header. I have Coordinator Hess's authorization code. I submitted both to the Directorate 9 days ago, with a formal request for inclusion. The Directorate has no record of your submission. I have the delivery confirmation. Delegate Ockhafer. Speaker Core's voice did not rise, but something underneath it changed register, the way a held door changes when the hand on it stops being polite. This chamber does not exist to relitigate the Compliance Directorate's procedures. You are here to respond to the findings, not to interrogate this Assembly's record-keeping. It was, Raina understood in that moment, watching 400 delegate boxes lean very slightly forward in unison, not actually about the frigate. She had felt it building for days, in ways she had not fully named to herself until this exact instant. The invitation to attend the plenary session 3 days ago had arrived through the Compliance Directorate's own office rather than through the ordinary scheduling channel the mission normally used, a small irregularity she had noted and then, in the press of 11 other assignments, let pass without escalating. The agenda item's placement, second on a docket of 19, rather than buried where a routine compliance matter usually sat, was another. The seating chart, when she checked it that morning, showed an unusually high attendance projection for a session whose only substantive business was, on paper, the downgrade of a minor missions observer status, a detail the mission's own protocol office had flagged as odd and then, like her, filed away rather than acted on, because none of the individual irregularities, taken alone, had seemed worth raising an alarm over. Taken together, standing at the podium with 941 worlds' attention already fixed on her, the pattern was no longer subtle at all. It had simply taken her, as it had taken everyone else on the mission staff, exactly this long to see it assembled into a single shape. She had suspected as much for 11 days. The frigate incident was real, a genuine 400-kilometer drift, corrected within 90 minutes, flagged and logged by the Amara Vos S own crew before anyone in the Assembly had noticed it. But it was a small thing, the kind of small thing that happened constantly among the Assembly's 941 member species, and was resolved with an apology and a procedural note. It had been sitting in a compliance queue for 8 months, unremarked, until 3 weeks ago, when a coalition of member worlds, Raina had counted 11, led by the Thren Dominion and the Iskar Concordat, 2 of the Assembly's oldest and most influential blocs, had petitioned to have it escalated. The coalition's public reasoning, filed in the record, was proportionality and precedent. Raina had a different theory, one she had not been able to prove and had therefore not said aloud to anyone above her own pay grade, that the coalition wanted, for reasons that had nothing to do with one frigate and everything to do with the trade concessions Earth had been quietly negotiating in 3 other committees that quarter, to remind the newest species with a seat in this assembly exactly how much standing that seat actually carried. Which was to say, none, unless the assembly's older members decided otherwise. "I'm not interrogating the record," Raina said. "I'm asking that it be corrected before a vote that will downgrade my mission status is taken on the basis of an incomplete one." "The chair has ruled," Speaker Core said, The findings stand. Do you have anything further to offer in response to the substance of the reprimand? An acknowledgement, an apology, a statement of remedial action? Or does the human delegation intend to spend the remainder of its allotted floor time contesting this assembly's competence to manage its own records? The laugh from the tiers had spread, quietly, into something that was not quite laughter anymore, but had the same shape. A low current of amusement moving through 941 delegations that had, almost all of them, sat through some version of this scene before, watching some newer, smaller mission try to argue procedure against a body old enough to have written the procedures for the express purpose of being unanswerable to them. Raina felt her face go warm and made herself stand very still, because she had also learned, in 14 months, that the chamber read stillness as one thing and motion as another, and she needed, right now, to be read correctly. "I have a statement of remedial action," she said. "The Terran Observer mission has already implemented additional flight corridor verification protocols for all logistics runs within contested zones, effective the week following the incident. I can enter the protocol documentation into the record. I don't have an apology to offer for a resupply mission that this Assembly's own mediation office requested, because I don't believe an apology is owed. I believe a correction to the record is owed. I've asked for that correction. The chair has declined it." The chamber's low current of amusement stopped. It stopped the way a held breath stops, not into silence, but into a different kind of attention, sharper and less comfortable. 400 delegate boxes recalibrating in real time what kind of scene this actually was. Raina had, without entirely planning to, just told 941 worlds that their oldest deliberative body's presiding officer was declining to correct a record he knew to be incomplete. Speaker Cor's expression did not change. That, more than anything he said next, told Raina she had made a serious mistake, not a mistake of fact but a mistake of form. He had wanted this to be a small, forgettable procedural humiliation, the kind that got a species' mission status quietly downgraded, and taught a lesson that would circulate afterward as a story other juniors told each other in the observer lounges. She had just made it into something the record would remember with her objection still attached, and there was exactly one way, in a chamber built on 900 years of precedent about what happened to delegates who embarrassed a sitting speaker on the open floor, for him to close that off cleanly. "Stewards," Speaker Cor said, "the delegate will observe proper floor conduct for the remainder of this session." Raina did not, at first, understand what that meant. She understood it 4 seconds later, when the 2 stewards who had taken her slate stepped forward from the rail and each took hold of one of her arms. "Assembly Statute 6, Speaker Cor said to the chamber now, not to her, in the tone of a man citing a rule so old and so settled that citing it barely required looking up the number, requires that any delegate found in contempt of the chair during a disciplinary proceeding assume the posture of formal submission for the remainder of the session, as a demonstration of the body's continued authority over its own floor. The chair finds the human delegate in contempt." "I haven't been," Raina started. The steward on her left arm pressed down, once firmly on her shoulder, not violently, almost gently, in the specific, practiced way of someone who had done this many times before, and understood that gentleness was, in fact, the more efficient method of getting a body to kneel. Raina went down onto the marble floor of the Galactic Assembly's plenary chamber, in front of 941 worlds, because 2 assembly stewards had put their hands on her shoulders, and there was, in that specific configuration of force and posture, and a body that did not want to be dragged, no way to stay standing that did not look worse than kneeling. The marble was cold through her trousers. Above her in the tiers, the low current of attention broke into something else, not laughter exactly, not yet, but a rustle, a murmur, hundreds of species worth of body language shifting at once, and somewhere in that rustle Raina heard, quite clearly, one voice. She never found out whose, and it did not matter, say something in Thren dialect that her translation node rendered, half a second later, directly into her ear. Look how small it kneels. She stayed down for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She knew the exact figure because she counted it, because counting was the only thing she had left to do with the part of her mind that was screaming, and because she understood, with a cold, distant clarity that felt like watching herself from the observer's rail rather than being the one on the floor, that whatever she did in the next 4 minutes would be the only thing anyone in this chamber remembered about her, or about Earth, for a very long time. She did not cry, she did not speak. She knelt on the marble with her hands loose at her sides and her spine straight, and she watched Speaker Core's boots at the edge of her vision, and she thought, not with anger yet, anger would come later in the shuttle in the dark, alone, she thought. Someone is going to have to explain this. She was right. She simply did not yet know how quickly, or how completely, or how far the explanation would travel. 3 weeks before the vote, in a private dining annex 2 levels below the plenary floor, Thren senior delegate Oskavin Rel had hosted a dinner for 6 coalition partners that no record of the Assembly's proceedings would ever formally acknowledge took place. Reyna had not been present for it, would not learn the specifics of it for months, and would, even then, only ever piece together a partial account from Ambassador Iset Vaughn, whose staff had a junior aide seconded temporarily to Rel's household that season, and who reported back, in fragments, what she overheard while pouring drinks. The dinner's stated purpose, according to the single-line item that did survive in the Thren Dominion's own internal calendar, was coordination on pending compliance matters. Its actual purpose, as Iset reconstructed it, was narrower and considerably more deliberate. The dining annex itself was small by Assembly standards, a private room reserved for senior delegations, its walls lined with a soft amber stone quarried, according to the plaque beside the door, from a Thren homeworld quarry that had not operated in over a century, its use now purely ceremonial. 6 settings were laid at a round table with no head and no foot, a deliberate design choice the Thren favored for exactly this kind of gathering, since a round table let every delegate present believe, for the length of a meal, that the conversation was a discussion among equals rather than an audience gathered around whichever delegate had actually convened it. Oskavin Rel did not need the illusion of equality to control the room. He had learned, across 19 years on the Compliance Directorate's Oversight Committee, that the most effective way to move 5 other delegations toward a decision he had already made was never to announce the decision at all, only to ask questions shaped so precisely that the answers his guests supplied felt, to each of them individually, like their own idea. "Tell me," he said, over the second course, to the Iskar Concordat's senior trade delegate, a broad-shouldered woman named Sethmarn who had sat on more compliance panels than anyone else at the table besides Rel himself. "How many species, in your experience, have joined this assembly, and never once required a correction to their understanding of where they stood among the rest of us?" Marn considered the question with the specific care of someone who understood she was being led somewhere and had decided, for reasons of her own, not to resist it. "None that I can recall," she said. "Every species eventually tests the boundary. The question is only ever whether the test is conducted by us, on our terms, or by them, on theirs." "Precisely," Rel said, and moved on to the next course, satisfied, without ever having to state the conclusion he had wanted her to reach on her own. The 3 smaller delegations at the table, representatives of worlds whose trade routes ran through corridors the Thren Dominion effectively controlled, said considerably less across the whole of the meal, and what little they did say tracked, with a consistency that would only become suspicious in hindsight, the shape of whatever Rel had said immediately before them. Iset's aide would later describe the dinner, in the single debrief she ever gave on the subject, as the quietest kind of consensus building I have ever watched. No one voted on anything, and by the time the final course was cleared, 6 delegations agreed on a course of action none of them could individually be shown to have proposed. Oskavin Rel had, by that point, sat on the Assembly's Compliance Directorate Oversight Committee for 19 years. He had watched in that time 4 separate species join the Assembly's ranks, and he had watched, with the specific satisfaction of a man who believed order was a virtue in itself, each of those 4 species undergo what the Thren called, informally and never in writing, an asterisk orientation event, a moment, usually within the first 2 decades of membership, in which the Assembly's older worlds made unmistakably clear to a newcomer exactly how much latitude its new seat actually carried. The orientation events were not, in Rel's private view, cruelty. They were pedagogy. A young species that had not yet been made to understand its place tended, in his considerable experience, to overreach in committee, to negotiate as though its votes carried the same weight as a 4th century member's, to forget that a seat at the table was a privilege extended, not a right inherited. Earth had held its seat for 11 years, and had not yet undergone an orientation event. Rel found this an oversight worth correcting, and he had said as much over the 3rd course to the 5 delegates gathered with him, representatives of the Iskar Concordat, the Velan Ministry, and 3 smaller worlds whose trade routes ran through corridors the Thren Dominion effectively controlled, and whose delegates, consequently, attended when invited and voted the way their invitations suggested they should. The frigate incident, when Rel's staff surfaced it from the Compliance Directorate's languishing backlog, was, by his own private assessment, imperfect material, a minor infraction, corrected within the hour by the human's own crew, the kind of thing that under ordinary circumstances would have closed with an apology note and never reached a plenary floor at all. But it had one property none of the alternatives his staff had surveyed possessed: a clean procedural hook, a finding the Compliance Directorate could escalate on paper without anyone needing to argue that Earth had done anything genuinely dangerous. The orientation event, properly conducted, was never supposed to be about genuine danger. It was supposed to be about visibility, a lesson delivered publicly enough, and to a delegate junior enough that the lesson's real audience, watching from every other small and uncertain new member world in the chamber, understood exactly what it was being shown. The senior envoy is recalled, Rel noted at the dinner, consulting a briefing note his staff had prepared. The deputy has taken ill. The mission's most junior attaché will stand the floor for this session. He had allowed himself, Isset's aide reported, something almost like satisfaction at that detail, not because he wished Reyna Akafer any particular harm, whom he had never met and would not have recognized by name before that dinner, but because a junior delegate, alone, unbacked by seniority, was precisely the instrument an orientation event required. A senior envoy would have known how to fold gracefully. A senior envoy would have apologized before the chamber ever needed to compel anything. It was, in Rel's calculation, the least experienced voice in the room that would produce the clearest demonstration, and demonstrations, to be pedagogically useful, needed to be unambiguous. What Oskavin Rel did not know, could not have known, sitting in that private annex 3 weeks before the vote, congratulating himself quietly on a plan whose procedural cleanliness he found genuinely elegant, was that 11 years earlier, in a briefing room in Geneva, a much younger Priya Kessler-Radami had sat through a historical review of exactly this pattern. 4 species, 4 orientation events, 4 public humiliations of junior delegates, each one absorbed. Each one folded into quiet institutional deference, and had asked her superiors a single question that no one in that room had been able to answer to her satisfaction. What happens the first time one of us doesn't fold? She had spent the 6 years since building the answer. Motion 2291 passed on a voice vote at 11 minutes past the hour. Earth's mission status was downgraded from provisional observer to monitored petitioner, effective immediately, with a formal notation in the record, read aloud by the Assembly's clerk, in the flat cadence reserved for procedural findings, that the downgrade included conditional standing pending demonstrated improvement in delegate conduct. Raina was allowed to stand once the vote closed. Nobody helped her up. She stood on her own, brushed the dust of 900 years of marble foot traffic from her knees, and walked back to the observer's rail to collect what remained of her possessions, which the stewards returned to her without comment. The slate, the stylus, not the pen, which had apparently been filed as evidence in a contempt proceeding that no longer existed on paper anywhere Raina could find it, then or ever. She did not look up into the tears on the way out. She did not need to. She could feel 941 worlds worth of attention on the back of her neck the entire walk to the exit doors, and she understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried her through the 4 minutes on the floor, that this was the point. The frigate had never mattered. The vote had never really mattered. What mattered to the Thren Dominion and the Iskar Concordat and the 11-member coalition that had spent 3 weeks maneuvering a minor compliance flag into a disciplinary motion was that 941 worlds had just watched a human kneel on the assembly floor and would carry that image into every negotiation Earth's mission conducted for years afterward. She made it as far as the transit lounge outside the plenary hall before Ambassador Iset von caught up with her. Iset was a Corvin, tall, silver-scaled, with the flattened crest and slow-blinking triple eyelids of a species that had held a seat in this assembly for over 4 centuries and had, in Raina's 14 months of observing the floor, never once raised its voice. Iset had been the Corvin Compact's senior delegate for longer than Raina had been alive, and was, as far as Raina could tell, one of perhaps a dozen delegates in the entire chamber who treated the Earth mission's junior staff as something other than furniture. "Delegate Akafer," Iset said, falling into step beside her. "A moment, if you'll permit it." Raina kept walking. "I'd rather not be seen talking to anyone right now, Ambassador. No offense." "None taken. I would still like a moment." Iset's translated voice carried a particular flatness that Raina had learned over 14 months corresponded to something like anger in Corvin vocal register, a species that expressed distress not by rising in pitch, but by draining all inflection out entirely. What was done to you on that floor today was not standard proceeding. Statute 6 has not been invoked against a delegate in this assembly in 11 years. The last time it was used against a member of the Thren Dominion's own junior mission for striking another delegate. It has never, in 4 centuries of this assembly's record, been used against a delegate for the offense of asking that a document be entered. "I'm aware," Raina said. "Are you aware that Speaker Corps requires a 2/3 procedural consensus to invoke Statute 6 outside a violence finding, and that no such consensus vote took place on that floor today?" Raina stopped walking. "He didn't call a vote," she said slowly. "He just cited it." "Cited it," Iset agreed, "and no one on that floor corrected him, because no one on that floor wished to be the delegation that stood up for the human mission today. I did not stand up either, Delegate Akafer, and I will carry that with me, because I understood in the moment what would happen to my own mission standing if I did." The Corvin's crest lowered slightly, a gesture Raina had never had translated for her, but that she understood in that moment without needing it translated. "I am telling you this because someone should, and because I suspect no one else will, and because I believe, though I cannot prove it, and would deny saying it if asked, that what happened to you on that floor today was not compliance enforcement. It was theater, staged for an audience of 11 coalition members who wished to send your government a message using your body as the delivery method. I am sorry. It will not undo the last 4 minutes. But I did not want you to walk out of this building believing that what happened was lawful, because it was not, and someone in your government's chain of command is going to need to know that precisely, and soon." Raina looked at the old Corvin ambassador for a long moment. "Why tell me?" she asked. You said it yourself, you didn't stand up either. You could let this end quietly, the way I suspect the coalition assumes it will. No one would fault you for staying out of it. No one would fault me, Iset agreed. I would fault myself, which I have found, across 4 centuries, to be the more exacting judge. I am an old delegate Akafer, from an old and cautious species, and I have watched a great many injustices pass through this chamber without comment, because caution is what has kept the Corving Compact's seat secure for 411 years. I am not certain caution is a virtue I still wish to practice without limit. You are the first human I have spoken with at any length in 14 months of your mission's presence in this assembly. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not wish the first substantial thing I ever say to you to be silence. Thank you, Ambassador, Reyna said. I'll remember that you said it. I would prefer you didn't, Iset said, in any forum where it could be repeated, but I understand if circumstances require otherwise. The ambassador inclined its crested head, the Corvin equivalent. Reyna had learned of a very formal bow and walked away down the transit lounge without another word. Reyna stood alone for a moment amid the flow of departing delegations, none of whom met her eyes, all of whom, she noticed, gave her a wide and deliberate berth, as though contempt might be contagious. And then she took out her slate, the one the stewards had returned to her, and opened a secure channel to Geneva. The message she sent was 4 words long, Statute 6. No consensus vote. She did not know, sending it, that it would reach Fleet Coordination Command inside 11 minutes, or that it would be read, inside 30, by a woman named Admiral Priya Kessler-Radami, who had spent the last 6 years of her career preparing, in exhaustive and mostly theoretical detail, for exactly the situation Reyna's 4 words described. Before the shuttle from the plenary hall had even cleared the assembly's atmospheric boundary, a Velan freelance correspondent named Tess Adrai, one of perhaps 40 accredited independent journalists who covered the assembly floor for outlets outside any member government's direct control, had already filed the first version of what would become, within a day, the single most replayed piece of footage in the Assembly's broadcast history. Adrai had covered 11 plenary sessions that quarter. She had never, in 3 years on the floor beat, seen a Statute 6 invocation, and she had certainly never seen one used against an accredited delegate for the offense of requesting a document. She had also, notably, been the only correspondent on the floor that day who had bothered, in the 90 seconds after Speaker Corr's ruling, to check the Assembly's own public procedural archive for the consensus vote requirement, a 5-minute search that any of the other 39 correspondents present could have run and none had, because none of them had expected the ruling to be worth checking. Her first report, filed while Reyna's shuttle was still in transit, ran a single line beneath the raw floor footage. Speaker Corr invoked Statute 6 against the Terran delegate without the recorded consensus vote the statute requires. Full analysis to follow. It reached 6 million viewers in the first hour. By the time Reyna's shuttle docked at the mission annex, it had reached 40 million, translated automatically into over 300 languages by relay stations that had no editorial stake in the story, and simply forwarded whatever the Assembly's own public feed carried, because that was what the transparency policy required them to do. Oskavin Rel, watching the numbers climb from his own office 2 levels below the chamber where he had hosted his private dinner 3 weeks earlier, understood within the hour that something in his calculation had gone wrong, though it would be another full day before he understood exactly what, or how badly. The full, uncut floor recording reached the wider public feeds within 2 hours of the vote, not through any leak, but because the Assembly live-streamed every plenary session as a matter of transparency policy, a policy nobody on the Threnaskar Coalition staff had apparently thought through to its conclusion. By the time Reyna's shuttle reached the Terran mission's orbital annex, the clip of her kneeling on the marble floor, 4 minutes and 12 seconds, unedited, time-stamped, had been viewed, translated, and retransmitted across every major relay in the Assembly's territory, and several outside it. Director Okonkwo Baptiste was waiting in the Annex's arrivals bay when Reina's shuttle docked. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had spent 30 years as a career diplomat learning to fold anger into something quieter and more useful. And Reina had never, in 14 months working under him, seen him look the way he looked now. "I want you to know," he said, before she had even finished crossing the gantry, "that this was not your failure. I need you to hear that before anything else, because I know how this feels, and I know what your instinct is going to be, and I need you to set it aside long enough to hear me." "I asked for a document to be entered," Reina said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, the same steadiness that had carried her through the 4 minutes on the floor, and she understood distantly that it was a kind of shock. "That's what got me on the floor, a document." "I know." "They took the pin Grandma Adiz gave me, filed it as evidence." "I know that too." Okonkwo Baptiste's jaw tightened. "Reina, look at me. I need you to focus, because there isn't time for this to be about how it feels, not yet. There's going to be time for that. I promise you there's going to be time, but not yet. Isset Vaughn's office reached out to mine 40 minutes ago. Statute 6 was invoked without the required consensus vote. Do you understand what that means procedurally?" "It means Cor broke his own assembly's rules." "It means," Okonkwo Baptiste said, "that the compulsion used against you on that floor was not a lawful sanction under this assembly's own charter. It was an unlawful use of force against an accredited diplomatic delegate, on the record, broadcast to 941 worlds." He paused, and something in his face shifted, not softening, but sharpening, the diplomat's mask coming fully back down over whatever had been underneath it a moment ago. "Which is a very specific category of event, Reina. It's the category of event Fleet Command has had a standing response framework for since before you and I were assigned to this mission. I need to make a call. I need you to come with me, because Geneva is going to want your account directly, and I need you steady when you give it. Can you be steady?" Reina thought about the marble floor, about the 4 minutes, about the voice she never identified, saying, "Look how small it kneels," in a language her own ear had translated without her permission. "Yes," she said, "I can be steady." Admiral Priya Kessler-Radamy had, for 6 years, run something inside Fleet Coordination Command that had no official name and appeared on no organizational chart, though the handful of people who knew it existed called it, informally, the Precedent Desk. The Precedent Desk's function, as Kessler-Radamy had explained it to exactly 4 people in 6 years, was simple: to catalog every diplomatic interaction between Earth's mission and the Galactic Assembly's member species, flag every instance in which Assembly protocol was violated against a human delegate, and maintain, quietly, continuously, without ever once briefing it upward as anything more urgent than a standing contingency file, a response posture keyed to exactly one trigger condition. Not an insult, not a slight, not even a formal diplomatic breach in the ordinary sense, because the ordinary sense of diplomatic breach happened constantly among 941 species, and resolving it was what embassies were for. The trigger condition, precisely defined in a document that had been revised 11 times in 6 years, and had, until 4 hours ago, never once been met, was this: an unlawful physical compulsion used against an accredited human diplomat by a Galactic Assembly officer, in a forum in which the Assembly's own charter had been violated to enable it, with the event captured on an evidentiary record the Assembly itself could not later dispute. Kessler-Radamy had built the framework 6 years ago, not because she expected the Assembly to attack Earth outright. Nobody serious expected that. Earth's mission was too small, too new, too obviously outmatched for any coalition to gain anything from open conflict. But because she had spent enough years studying the Assembly's internal politics to understand a colder truth. that a body built on 900 years of hierarchy among member species had exactly one recurring failure mode, and that failure mode was the newest, smallest members. Every species that had ever joined the assembly in living memory had, at some point in its first 2 decades of membership, been tested, not by war, which was expensive and reputationally costly, but by exactly this kind of theater, a manufactured procedural crisis, aimed at a junior delegate, designed to establish, on the public record, precisely how much deference the newcomer owed its elders. Most species absorbed the test. They apologized. They downgraded their own posture to match what the assembly had decided their standing should be. They learned, in other words, to kneel, sometimes literally, as 11 other species founding delegates had, on that same marble floor, in the 4 centuries of the assembly's video record that Kessler-Radamy's staff had spent 2 years quietly cataloging. Kessler-Radamy had built the precedent desk on a single wager: that Earth would, eventually, be tested the same way, and that when it happened, the correct response was not a protest, not a formal complaint rooted through the Assembly's own dispute resolution office, an office that, her research showed, resolved in favor of the complainant in question in under 4% of cases brought against a sitting speaker, but something the Assembly's 900 years of institutional memory had never had cause to prepare for, because no species testing had ever, in that entire history, arrived already answered. She had briefed the framework in outline to exactly 2 civilian officials, the Secretary General's Chief of Staff, 6 years ago, and 4 years ago in far greater detail, to a closed session of the Joint Defense Council, where it had been approved, reluctantly, by a narrow margin, with several members on record calling it premature and needlessly provocative, as Contingency Framework Ashwood. Contingency Framework Ashwood specified, among a great many other things, the exact deployment posture of the Third Fleet's Forward Response Group. 18 vessels, held at a staging point 4 transit lane jumps from Assembly Prime, at a readiness state that could bring them to the Assembly's home system within 31 hours of activation. At 4 hours and 6 minutes after Reyna Akafer's knees touched the marble floor of the Galactic Assembly's plenary chamber, Admiral Kessler-Radamy received Director Okonkwo Baptiste's report, cross-referenced it against the evidentiary footage already circulating on every public relay in Assembly space, confirmed against her own legal staff that Statute 6 had been invoked without the required consensus vote, and activated Contingency Framework Ashwood. She did not do this quickly, or lightly, or with any of the satisfaction that 6 years of preparation might have earned her. She did it methodically, over the course of 90 minutes, cross-checking every trigger condition against the framework's own language 3 separate times, because she understood, better than almost anyone in Fleet Command, exactly how large a thing she was setting in motion, and exactly how impossible it would be to call it back once it began moving. "Confirm the trigger," she said at last to the duty officer at her side. "Read it back to me." "Unlawful physical compulsion against an accredited human diplomat," the duty officer read, from the framework's own text, "by a Galactic Assembly officer, in a forum in which the Assembly's own charter was violated to enable it, captured on an evidentiary record the Assembly cannot later dispute. Confirmed on all 4 conditions, Admiral." Time-stamped Assembly floor footage, 12 minutes, no edits, watched 300 million times as of this briefing. "Then we're confirmed," Kessler-Radamy said. "Activate Ashwood, Forward Response Group to staging alert, and get me a secure line to the Secretary General. She's going to want to make a call before the fleet does." The Secretary General's call, when it came, lasted 4 minutes. Kessler-Radamy had rehearsed the briefing 100 times in 6 years of tabletop exercises, and every rehearsal had assumed a Secretary General who needed convincing, who would ask, reasonably, whether 18 ships were proportionate, whether there was a slower option, whether Fleet Command had considered what happened if the Assembly's home defenses read the formation as a genuine attack and responded in kind. Secretary General Amara Voss Lindqvist, a woman who had spent 30 years in refugee resettlement policy before ever touching foreign affairs, and who had, privately, always found the precedent desk's existence faintly embarrassing until the exact moment she needed it, asked none of those questions. "You built this for today," she said instead, "6 years ago. You built this for exactly today." "I built it for a day I hoped would never come, ma'am." "But you built it anyway." "Yes." There was a pause on the line long enough that Kessler Radami checked the connection status twice. "Activate it," Voss Lindqvist said. "And Admiral, I want every ship in that formation broadcasting standard commercial transponder codes until the moment they decelerate into the home system. I don't want this to look like an attack for 1 second longer than strategically necessary, because the instant it looks like an attack instead of an answer, we lose the only thing that actually protects that young woman going forward, which is being unmistakably in the right." "Is that understood by everyone in that formation?" "Down to the last helmsman, ma'am. It's in the framework's operating doctrine. We don't fire first. We don't fire at all unless fired upon. We arrive, we hold, and we let the footage of what happened to Delegate Acaffer do the rest of the arguing." "Good," Voss Lindqvist said. "Because if this goes wrong, Admiral, it doesn't go wrong as a skirmish. It goes wrong as the first interstellar war in this species' history, over 4 minutes on a marble floor, and I need you to understand that I am authorizing this with that fact fully in view, not despite it." "I understand it fully, ma'am. I've understood it for 6 years." The Forward Response Group's transit was not, in the end, entirely without incident. 9 hours into the 29-hour approach, the lead vessel's sensor officer flagged an unregistered contact holding position at the edge of the second transit lane jump. A single ship, unresponsive to hailing, running no transponder code at all, sitting directly athwart the corridor the convoy needed to use. Commander Aldrich Nairi, captaining the formation's lead ship under Kessler Radami's direct authority, had 30 seconds, by his own later account, to make a decision that the framework's 6 years of tabletop preparation had never quite modeled cleanly. Divert the entire formation around an unknown contact, adding 4 hours to an approach whose entire strategic value depended on speed, or hold course and risk a confrontation with a vessel that might, for all his sensors could tell him, belong to the Thren Dominion's own defense fleet, sent ahead exactly to provoke the incident his orders forbade him from starting. He held course, closed to hailing range, and opened a plain language channel. The contact turned out to belong to no defense fleet at all. It was a single independent salvage vessel, a Velun-registered scrap hauler with a transponder malfunction 11 days old that its 2-person crew had not yet found the parts to repair, going about entirely unrelated business in a corridor it had used for cargo runs for 6 years without incident. Its captain, when the hailing channel opened, spent the first 30 seconds of the exchange too startled by the sudden appearance of 18 warships to say anything coherent at all. Nairi logged the encounter, cleared the salvage vessel to continue on its own heading, and held the formation's course. It was, in the framework's after-action review months later, flagged as the single moment in the entire operation where the margin between a diplomatic answer and an accidental war had been thinnest, not in the Assembly's chamber, and not in the 18 ships' arrival, but in 9 seconds of open channel with a frightened scrap hauler captain who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour, and whose survival, in a strict operational sense, had depended entirely on a fleet commander choosing to hail before he decided anything else. "We nearly started it over a broken transponder on a garbage scow," Nairi told Kessler Radami in his after-action debrief, with the specific flatness of a man who had not slept properly since the encounter. "I want that in the record, Admiral. Not because I think we did anything wrong, because I think the next commander who runs this framework needs to know exactly how close 9 seconds can be. Kessler-Adami had it entered into the record, unedited, exactly as he asked. Raina did not know that first night that any of this was happening. She knew only that Geneva had taken her statement, a cold, careful 40-minute debrief conducted by a staffer she didn't recognize, over a secure line in which she recounted the frigate findings, Speaker Corps' refusal to correct the record, the invocation of Statute 6, the 4 minutes, the voice from the tiers, and that at the end of it the staffer had said only, "Thank you, Delegate Akafer. Please remain reachable. Someone senior will be in touch," in a tone that told her nothing except that something, somewhere above her, had shifted gears. She spent that night in her quarters in the mission annex, not sleeping, replaying the 4 minutes in a loop she couldn't stop, not because she regretted anything she had said or done, but because some animal part of her brain kept insisting there must have been a way to avoid it, some sentence she could have chosen instead, even though the rational part of her knew, with total clarity, that there hadn't been. The trap had been built before she ever reached the podium. She had simply been the one standing in it when it closed. She thought about her grandmother's pin. She thought, with a bitterness that surprised her, about how a body could spend 900 years building the most elaborate deliberative apparatus in known space, and still, in the end, decide that the correct instrument for making a point to a newcomer was a woman's knees on cold marble. Somewhere past midnight, unable to sleep and unwilling to keep replaying the same 4 minutes, she opened the folder the stewards had confiscated and later returned, the flight logs, the mediation transcripts, Deputy Coordinator Hess's original request, all of it still sitting exactly where she had assembled it 11 days earlier, and read through it again, from the beginning, as though rereading it carefully enough might change what had happened on the floor. It didn't. But somewhere in the 3rd hour of reading, she found herself doing something she hadn't expected, making notes, not for a formal complaint, not for anything she had been asked to produce. Just a private, careful accounting of every procedural irregularity she could identify in the vote, the missing consensus call, the refusal to enter documented evidence, the specific wording Speaker Corps had used when he cited Statute 6, the exact interval between his ruling and the steward's first physical contact with her. Because some part of her, even exhausted and furious, and still feeling the cold of the marble in her knees, understood that precision would matter later. Whatever later turned out to look like. She did not think, because she had no way to know, about Admiral Kessler-Adami, 4 transit lane jumps away, watching 18 vessels of the 3rd Fleet's Forward Response Group light their engines in sequence. Elsewhere in the mission annex, Deputy Envoy Marcus Ihajirika, the man whose stomach flu had put Raina at the podium in the first place, and who had spent the entire session watching the floor feed from a medical bay 2 levels below the plenary chamber, unable to do anything but watch, filed a report of his own that night, addressed not to Geneva, but to Director Okonkwo Baptiste directly, that would not surface publicly for months. "I want it on record," the report read in its entirety, "that I was well enough to stand that floor by midday, and chose not to say so because I believed, wrongly, I now understand that a quiet session on a minor compliance matter did not require me to push through a fever to attend it. I have watched the recording 11 times since. Delegate Akafer conducted herself with more composure under an unlawful compulsion than I believe I would have managed uncompelled. I am not writing this to excuse myself. I am writing it because I think this mission needs a policy, going forward, about who stands the floor on disciplinary items, and I do not think that policy should ever again default to whoever happens to be healthy that morning." Okonkwo Baptiste read the report twice, said nothing about it to Raina for 6 months, and quietly rewrote the mission's floor assignment protocol before the week was out. Raina slept, eventually, for perhaps 3 hours, and woke to a message from Okonkwo Baptiste asking her to report to the mission's secure briefing suite at first light. She assumed, walking there, that she was about to be told the shape of some formal complaint process. A tribunal filing, perhaps, or a diplomatic note delivered through the proper channels. The kind of slow institutional response she had spent 14 months learning to expect from Earth's mission, which had never once, in her experience, moved faster than the assembly it was answering to. She was not told that because it was not true, and Okonkwo Baptiste did not lie to her about it, though he also did not tell her that morning the full shape of what was actually happening. What he told her instead, carefully, in a voice pitched for a room he had swept twice for listening devices before she arrived, was that Geneva had activated a standing response, that the details were compartmented above both their clearances, and that her only task for the next several hours was to remain in the annex, reachable, and to say nothing to anyone, including other delegations, about the Statute 6 irregularity beyond what Isset Vaughn's office already knew. "How long," Raina asked, "is the next several hours?" "I don't know," Okonkwo Baptiste said, which she believed, because his face did the specific thing it did when he genuinely didn't know something rather than when he decided not to tell her. She spent those hours the way she had spent most of her 14 months on the mission, working, because working was the only reliable answer she had ever found to the particular kind of dread that came from knowing something large was moving somewhere she couldn't see it. She reviewed 3 unrelated trade dossiers. She drafted, then deleted, then redrafted a note to her grandmother that she did not know how to write without either lying about what had happened or frightening her, and in the end sent nothing at all, reasoning that the footage would reach Adiz Okafor's own feed soon enough regardless of what her granddaughter said about it first. She ate nothing. She drank 3 cups of a Terran import coffee, substitute the mission kept perpetually and mediocrely brewed in the annex's small kitchen, and she found herself, twice, standing at the annex's single viewport, looking out at a starfield that gave her no information at all about what was approaching through it. She did not know, standing there the second time, that the forward response group had, at that exact hour, crossed its second transit lane jump, and briefly, alarmingly, nearly opened fire on a broken-down scrap hauler 4 transit lane jumps away. She would not learn about the salvage vessel, or how close 9 seconds had come to changing everything, for several more days. One of a great many things about the 18 hours that followed that she would only ever piece together afterward, in fragments, from people who had been present for parts of it she hadn't. What she did notice, by the 14th hour, was a change in the mission annex's atmosphere that she couldn't immediately name. Staff who had spent the previous day treating her with the careful, slightly averted courtesy people extend to someone who has recently suffered something they don't know how to discuss began, instead, to look at her directly, briefly, almost involuntarily. The way people look at something they've just been told is more significant than they'd previously understood it to be. Nobody told her why. She noticed it anyway, the specific human instinct for reading a room even when the room refuses to explain itself. And she understood, without being able to prove it, that whatever Okonkwo Baptiste couldn't tell her was beginning to become visible to people even further from the center of it than she was. By the 18th hour, unable to bear the not knowing any longer, she asked the one question she suspected might get an answer. Not what was happening, but whether it was going to make things worse. Okonkwo Baptiste considered the question for long enough that she thought he might not answer it at all. "I think," he said finally, "it's going to make things exactly as bad as they need to be, and not 1 degree worse than that, if the people running it are as careful as I believe them to be. That's the most honest thing I can tell you right now. I'm sorry it isn't more." "It's more than I had an hour ago," Raina said. 90 minutes later, the mission annex's secure channel lit up with the first confirmed report of 18 Terran vessels holding formation above Assembly Prime, and Raina Okafor understood, all at once and with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what 4 words sent from a transit lounge had actually set in motion. The Galactic Assembly did not notice the fleet for 19 hours. This was not, Kessler-Adami had explained to the Joint Defense Council 4 years earlier, an oversight in the framework. It was the framework's central design principle. The Forward Response Group did not travel dark, exactly. Concealment against assembly-grade sensor arrays was neither possible nor, strategically, the point. It traveled *quiet*. Transponders broadcasting standard commercial transit codes, formation spacing calibrated to read, on any routine long-range scan, as a scheduled convoy of Terran trade vessels running the Assembly Prime Supply Corridor, a corridor human logistics ships had used, without incident or particular notice, for 6 years. Nobody in the Assembly's Compliance Directorate flagged it. Nobody in the Thren Dominion's considerable intelligence apparatus flagged it. It was not until the 18 vessels crossed the final transit threshold into Assembly Prime's home system, 29 hours after Kessler-Adami's activation order, and began decelerating into a formation that no commercial convoy in the recorded history of the corridor had ever assumed, that anyone in the Assembly's defense infrastructure registered what they were actually looking at. By then it was far too late to matter in any operational sense. It had never, Kessler-Adami would say later, been meant to matter operationally. 18 vessels, however capable, were not an invasion force against a home system defended by the combined orbital assets of the Assembly's founding worlds. Ashwood had never been designed to win a war. It had been designed to make one specific fact impossible to ignore. That Earth had known, with total certainty, exactly what response its own diplomats' mistreatment would trigger, and had been ready to deliver that response inside 31 hours, using a corridor the Assembly itself had spent 6 years treating as beneath its notice. What Kessler-Adami's framework had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, because it depended on a decision made by someone entirely outside her chain of command, in a fleet she did not control, acting under authority she had no visibility into, was the Thren Dominion's own home defense wing. The Thren Dominion maintained, independent of the Assembly's collective defense architecture, a standing border fleet of its own, 61 vessels, garrisoned at 3 stations along the Dominion's frontier, under the command of Fleet Marshal Corvin Desalaru, a career officer who had spent 38 years defending Thren space, and precisely no years at all serving under any authority that answered to the Assembly's civilian leadership. Alaru received word of the Terran formation's arrival at Assembly Prime through his own intelligence channels, 11 minutes after the 18 vessels decelerated into visible formation, and he received it critically, before he received any briefing at all on what had happened to a junior human delegate on the plenary floor 2 days earlier, a detail his staff had filed at the time as a minor procedural item unworthy of his attention. What Alaru saw, in other words, was this: an unidentified alien battle formation of 18 vessels, unannounced, undeclared, materializing without warning at the seat of Assembly government, using deceptive transponder codes to approach undetected. He did not see a wronged delegate. He did not see a framework built in patient response to a specific, documented injustice. He saw, through the narrow and understandably alarmed lens of a border commander, whose entire career had trained him to treat exactly this kind of silent approach as the opening move of an attack, a hostile power inside the Assembly's home system, and he moved 41 vessels of his border fleet to intercept, without waiting for the civilian authorization his own service regulations technically required, because, as he stated afterward, in the inquiry that followed, regulations assume there is time to wait. I did not believe there was time. The Thren Intercept Force reached the edge of Assembly Prime's outer defense perimeter 9 hours after the Terran formation's arrival, precisely as Reyna's recorded statement was being prepared for transmission, and Fleet Marshal Alaru opened a hailing channel to the Forward Response Group with a single demand. immediate withdrawal, full sensor telemetry disclosure, and boarding rights to 2 vessels of his choosing, to be granted within 15 minutes, or the intercept force would treat the formation as a confirmed hostile and act accordingly. Commander Nairi relayed the demand to Kessler-Radami, with 6 minutes remaining on Alaru's clock. "Do we comply?" Nairi asked. "No," Kessler-Radami said, and then, because she understood exactly what she was about to risk, said it again slower. "No, we do not grant boarding rights to a fleet not authorized by this Assembly's own civilian government to demand them. Hold position. Do not power weapons. Do not respond to the hail with anything but the same message we've been broadcasting since we crossed the threshold. We are here in response to an unlawful act against an accredited diplomat. We intend no hostile action, and we will not fire unless fired upon. Say it as many times as it takes." The message was still being repeated, on an open channel, when Fleet Marshal Alaru's clock ran out. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be reconstructed, in painstaking and occasionally contradictory detail, by 3 separate inquiries over the following year: the Assembly's own Defense Oversight Committee, the Thren Dominion's Internal Military Review, and a joint Human Corvin panel that Ambassador Iset Von would personally lobby to have convened, on the grounds that no single party to the incident could be trusted to investigate itself. All 3 inquiries agreed on the bare sequence of events, even where they disagreed sharply on blame. A single Thren escort vessel, the Asterisk vessel of watchful return, drifting at the edge of the intercept formation and running, as it would later emerge, a fire control system with a known and previously unreported targeting lock malfunction, registered a weapons lock warning against the nearest Terran vessel, and in the 11 seconds its automated defense protocol allowed for human, or Thren, confirmation before firing autonomously, its junior weapons officer, 23 years old and 11 months out of his service academy, did not countermand the system in time. The Asterisk vessel of watchful return fired 2 rounds of point defense ordnance, not designed as ship-killing weapons, but more than sufficient to breach a hull, at the Terran escort vessel Asterisk TFS Amara Vos II, named, deliberately, by Fleet Command 8 years earlier, for the same frigate whose flight logs had started the entire chain of events, a coincidence nobody involved found remotely comforting once it surfaced in the after-action review. Both rounds struck. The Asterisk Amara Vos II lost forward shielding, took hull damage across 2 decks, and reported in the frantic 30 seconds after impact, 3 crew injured, none fatally and life support holding. Commander Nairi had, by every doctrine Kessler-Radami's framework specified, full authorization to return fire. He held it for 4 seconds, an eternity, by the standards of the moment, and an eternity he would describe in his own inquiry testimony as the longest 4 seconds of his career, and gave, instead of a firing order, a single instruction: full defensive posture, shields to maximum, no offensive fire, and a request, transmitted simultaneously to both the Thren Intercept Force and the Assembly's own emergency channel, for an immediate ceasefire assessment before either side committed further. It held barely. For 11 minutes, while damage control teams on the Asterisk Amara Vos II fought to stabilize its breached decks and Fleet Marshal Alaru's own staff scrambled to determine whether the fire had been ordered or accidental, both fleets sat at full readiness, weapons live, waiting for a second shot that, had it come from either side, every officer present understood would not be survivable to stop with words alone. It was Ambassador Iset Von, alerted within minutes by an emergency relay from Director Okonkwo Baptiste, who broke the deadlock, not through any authority the Corvin ambassador actually possessed over either fleet, but by doing the one thing 411 years of Assembly seniority had taught was sometimes the only thing that worked: standing, in person, on an open frequency, and speaking directly to Fleet Marshal Alaru by name. "Des Alaru," Iset said, in a transmission that would later be studied by 3 separate militaries as a case study in de-escalation. I have known your family for 11 decades. I stood at your commissioning. I am telling you, on my own honor and not on any authority the Assembly has given me, that the vessels in that formation did not come to attack this system. They came because 2 days ago, on the floor of our own chamber in front of 941 worlds, this Assembly's presiding officer unlawfully compelled a human delegate to kneel, and her government had built, years in advance, a framework to answer exactly that act, and that is the entire truth of why they are here. Your weapons officer made an error. Their commander did not return fire when every doctrine he operates under permitted him to. If either fleet fires again in the next 60 seconds, it will not be because a wrong was done to your dominion. It will be because a system malfunction and 11 minutes of fear were allowed to become something this Assembly cannot undo. I am asking you, not as an ambassador, but as someone who held you as an infant to stand your fleet down. Fleet Marshal Alaru stood his fleet down 8 seconds later. The 8 seconds felt, to everyone monitoring the exchange from either fleet, considerably longer than 8 seconds. Commander Nairi would later describe watching his own tactical display during that interval. 61 Thren vessels holding weapons lock, 18 Terran vessels holding defensive posture, a damaged frigate bleeding atmosphere from 2 decks while its crew fought to seal the breach. An understanding, with a clarity he had not previously associated with combat readiness, that the entire remaining shape of the encounter now depended on whether one old ambassador's voice, transmitted on an open channel with no military authority behind it whatsoever, would be enough to overcome 38 years of a fleet marshal's professional instinct to answer force with force. It was. But Nairi kept, from that day forward, a private and somewhat unmilitary habit of thanking Ambassador Vaughn's office, in writing, on the anniversary of the encounter, for reasons he never fully explained to anyone who asked, and that everyone who knew the full account understood regardless. Aboard the Amara Vos Roman II damage control teams sealed the last of the hull breaches 4 minutes after Alaru's stand-down order, and Chief Engineer Petra Aldana, who had spent those 4 minutes coordinating repairs from a deck that was, for a portion of that time, open to hard vacuum on the other side of a single emergency bulkhead, filed a report that night containing a single line that Fleet Command would later choose, deliberately, not to redact from the public version of the after-action summary. We held the ship together with the same doctrine that held the ceasefire together. Nobody panicked. Nobody wanted this. Everybody did their job anyway. I don't know what else you want me to say about it, except that I'm glad we're all still here to say anything at all. The message that followed the fleet's arrival, transmitted on every open assembly channel, time-stamped, unencrypted, so that no member world could later claim it had not received it, was recorded not by Admiral Kessler-Radami, and not by the Secretary-General, but, at the Secretary-General's specific instruction, by Reina Akafer. She had argued against it, when Okonkwo Baptiste relayed the request to her, 26 hours after the vote, in the mission annex's cramped SecureComms room. I'm not a fleet officer, she said. I'm not even a senior envoy. Why does this come from me? Because it happened to you, Okonkwo Baptiste said. Because if Admiral Kessler-Radami reads that statement, it's a fleet commander delivering an ultimatum, and every historian in this Assembly's 900 years of record will file it exactly that way, as a threat. And if the Secretary-General reads it, it's a head of state making a demand, and it becomes a matter of state prestige, which means no one on that assembly floor can back down without losing face, which means it becomes a genuine crisis instead of a correction. But if you read it, the delegate who was on her knees on that floor 26 hours ago, it isn't a threat at all. It's an answer. And answers are much harder for a room full of proud old species to argue with than threats are. Raina looked at the short statement Fleet Command's legal staff had drafted, 3 lines long, stripped of every word that could be read as bluster or demand. She read it twice. "I want to change one word," she said. "Which one?" "It says deserved. No delegate of this mission has behaved in a manner that deserved what occurred on the assembly floor. I wanted to say required. Deserved sounds like I'm arguing about fairness. I'm not interested in whether it was fair. I'm interested in whether it was necessary, and it wasn't, and I want that word on the record." Okonkwo Baptiste looked at her for a long moment, and something that might, in a lesser crisis, have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Change the word," he said. Raina recorded the statement in the mission annex's smallest briefing room, alone except for a single technician, no delegation flag behind her, no ceremonial backdrop, nothing but a plain gray wall and the steady red light of the recording pickup. She had changed out of the clothes she'd worn on the assembly floor. She never wore them again, into a simple dark jacket with no insignia at all. And she stood, rather than sat, because some part of her understood that she needed this time to be seen on her feet. "My name is Raina Akafer," she said. "Yesterday, on the floor of this assembly, I asked that an accurate record be entered before a vote was taken. I was found in contempt, without the consensus vote your own charter requires, and compelled by force to kneel on camera in front of 941 worlds." She paused, exactly as long as she had rehearsed, no longer. "No delegate of this mission has behaved in a manner that required what occurred on that floor. This assembly's own record will show that, once it is corrected, and it will be corrected, because unlike the finding that was entered against me, the finding I am making now is one your own footage cannot dispute." She let that sit for one beat. "Some of you are asking, right now, why 18 Terran vessels are currently sitting in formation above Assembly Prime. I'll answer plainly, because plain answers are apparently unfamiliar to this chamber. They are not there to attack anyone. They are there because my government built a framework years ago that assumed, correctly, as it turns out, that eventually some coalition within this assembly would decide to test the newest member of your body the same way you have tested every other newest member for 4 centuries, using force against someone too junior to defend herself and too visible not to be believed. We do not intend to fight this assembly. We never intended to. We intended, when the day came, to be ready, and we were. That readiness is not a threat. It is the answer to the question your speaker asked me yesterday, when he asked whether the human delegation had anything further to offer this chamber." Another beat. "We have this to offer. We will not kneel again. We are not interested in an apology extracted through embarrassment, the way the Compliance Directorate wanted one extracted from me. We are interested in a corrected record, a properly conducted consensus vote on whether Statute 6 was lawfully invoked, and confirmation from this assembly that the era in which new members are tested this way is over, not because we have threatened you into ending it, but because you have just watched, in real time, what happens when you try it on a species that came prepared. Every one of the 940 other worlds in this chamber watching this broadcast should understand what that means for the next test this assembly considers running on someone smaller than itself. We would ask you to consider that there may not need to be a next time, for anyone." The recording ran 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Raina delivered it once without a retake, and when the technician confirmed the pickup had captured it clean, she sat down on the floor of the briefing room, not kneeling, simply sitting, her back against the gray wall, and put her head in her hands, and allowed herself, finally, to shake. The Assembly's plenary chamber reconvened in emergency session 4 hours after Raina's statement transmitted. Speaker Kaur called the session to order from a chair that several delegates present would later describe, in accounts that made their way into the Assembly's own gossip channels long before any formal record acknowledged it, as visibly unsteady, not from fear of the fleet above the atmosphere. Several of them insisted, since 18 vessels posed no credible military threat to a home system this well defended, but from the much more immediate and much more career-ending realization that 300 million viewers across the Assembly's territory had just watched him lie, on camera, about a document he knew existed. Ambassador Isset von requested the floor first. This was, in itself, unusual. The Corvin Compact rarely spoke early in a session, preferring, by long tradition, to let younger delegations exhaust their arguments before offering the weight of 4 centuries seniority. Isset did not do that today. "I move," the ambassador said, in that same flat, furious register Reyna had heard in the transit lounge, "that this chamber conduct the consensus vote Statute 6 required, and did not receive, retroactively on the record, so that every world present can determine for itself whether what was done to the Terran delegate yesterday was lawful under this body's own charter. I further move that the Compliance Directorate's original findings on Motion 2291 be struck and refiled, in full, including the mediation request from Deputy Coordinator Hess that the delegate attempted to enter and was denied. I do this not because a fleet is currently in orbit above us, though I will note, for the record, that it is, but because I have sat in this chamber for 411 years, and I watched, yesterday, something happen on this floor that this Assembly's charter does not permit, and I did not stand up when it happened, and I am ashamed of that, and I am done being ashamed of it silently." Not every delegation in the chamber agreed with Isset's motion, and the 90 minutes of debate that followed made that disagreement plain. Senior Delegate Oskavin Rel rose twice to object, the first time on procedural grounds, arguing that a retroactive vote set a dangerous precedent by allowing any ruling to be reopened under the pressure of a foreign military presence, a phrase he repeated 3 times, each time drawing a longer silence from the tiers than the last. The second time, more quietly, to argue that whatever irregularities had occurred in the vote's procedure, the underlying finding, that the frigate had entered restricted space, remained true regardless, and that this Assembly could not allow itself to reverse a legitimate compliance action simply because the delegate in question had since become, in his words, a sympathetic figure amplified by a broadcast feed. It was Counselor Is, the small gray archivist liaison who tracked record in nearly every session and almost never spoke in one, who answered him. Senior Delegate Rel asks this chamber not to be swayed by sympathy, Is said, in a voice so quiet the chamber's amplification had to compensate twice before the far tiers could hear it clearly. I would ask this chamber, instead, not to be swayed by 900 years of habit. I have kept this Assembly's record for 61 years. I have entered 11 prior instances of Statute 6 invoked against a founding delegate of a newly seeded species, going back 3 centuries before my own appointment. In every one of those 11 instances, the record I was required to keep showed no consensus vote, because no one in this chamber in 3 centuries had ever thought to check whether one had actually been called. I checked, this time, only because Ambassador von asked me to. I would like the chamber to sit with that fact for a moment before it votes, that the only reason this irregularity was caught at all was that the delegate wronged by it happened to belong to a species with a framework in orbit above us. I do not think that should be the deciding factor in whether this Assembly corrects an unlawful act. I think it should be the reason this Assembly finally asks how many times, before today, it was never caught at all. The chamber was very quiet after that. The retroactive consensus vote, when it was finally called, 90 minutes later, after a debate longer and more openly furious than the plenary chamber had hosted in a decade, found, by a margin of 608 votes to 211, with the balance abstaining, that Statute 6 had been unlawfully invoked against Delegate Reyna Acaffer. The Compliance Directorate's original findings were struck. Deputy Coordinator Hess's mediation request was entered into the record, exactly as Reyna had asked. One day and one small war's worth of readiness too late for it to have mattered at the time she asked. The vote also authorized, on a motion introduced almost as an afterthought by a mid-tier delegation that had said nothing at all until that point, the joint inquiry into the exchange of fire between the asterisk vessel of watchful return and the asterisk TFS Amara Vas II. The first time in the Assembly's recorded history that a body composed of member species other than the two directly involved had been impaneled to investigate an armed incident between them. The 3 injured crew of the asterisk Amara Vas II were named individually into the record, by request of Commander Nairi, who insisted, over the mild objection of Fleet Command's own press office, which would have preferred the incident described in aggregate, that a body which had almost gone to war over an insult to one named woman ought to be equally precise about the names of the people who had actually bled for the 11 minutes that followed. Speaker Vantelcourt resigned his chair before the session closed. He did not apologize on the record, though Reyna would learn, months later, through a channel she never fully traced, that a private letter had reached Director Okonkwo Baptiste's office, unsigned, containing 4 words that she chose in the end not to read. The 11-member coalition that had escalated the original frigate finding did not resign anything, and never formally acknowledged its role in the affair, though the Ascar Concordat's senior trade delegation was quietly reassigned within the month, and the Thren Dominion spent the better part of a year rebuilding relationships with smaller member worlds that had, it turned out, been watching the whole spectacle far more closely, and with far less sympathy for the coalition than anyone in the Dominion's leadership had assumed. The Forward Response Group held position above Assembly Prime for 6 days after the retroactive vote, not because Fleet Command distrusted the outcome, Kessler Radami would say later, in the single closed briefing she ever gave on contingency framework Ashwood's activation, but because a framework built to demonstrate readiness could not credibly withdraw the instant it achieved its purpose without demonstrating instead that the readiness had been a bluff. On the 7th day, the 18 vessels reformed into standard commercial transit spacing, broadcast the same quiet transponder codes they had carried on the way in, and departed the system along the same corridor, at the same unremarkable pace, as though they had never been anything other than a scheduled supply convoy. Nobody in the Assembly ever again treated that corridor, or that convoy pattern, as beneath notice. The joint inquiry into the exchange of fire took 4 months to complete. Its findings, when published, assigned no criminal culpability to the asterisk vessel of watchful return asterisk S young weapons officer. The malfunction in the ship's fire control system was confirmed as a known and previously unrepaired defect, logged and ignored by 2 prior maintenance cycles, and the panel found that 11 seconds was not, in any reasonable operational standard, sufficient time for a crew member of his experience to countermand an automated lock-in fire sequence. He had not been adequately trained to override manually. He was reassigned to a training command rather than a disciplinary board, a decision the inquiry's human members supported as firmly as its Thren and Corvin members did, and which Reyna, when she was asked for a statement on the finding, declined to comment on beyond a single line. I don't believe punishing a frightened 23-year-old fixes a fire control system nobody maintained. I'd rather the fix held than the blame. Fleet Marshal Alaru testified before the same panel for 11 hours across 3 sessions, and offered, at the close of his testimony, an admission that appeared nowhere in his official after-action report, and that reached the public record only because a Corvin observer on the panel insisted it be entered verbatim. That he had moved his intercept force before receiving any briefing on what had actually happened to Reyna Akafer, that he had judged the Terran formation exclusively on its silence and its shape, and that had he known, before ordering the intercept, precisely what his own assembly had done to provoke it, he did not believe he would have moved his fleet at all. I responded to a shadow, he told the panel. I did not ask, before I moved 61 ships to meet it, what had cast it. I do not think I am the last commander in this assembly's history who will make that mistake. I would like this testimony entered so that the next one has to read it first. The Thren Dominion's own internal review was less forthcoming. Oskavin Rel was never formally sanctioned for the private dinner 3 weeks before the vote. No rule of the Assembly's charter prohibited coalition building among member delegations, however its purpose might be characterized after the fact, and Rel's own account of the dinner, when it eventually became public through channels neither he nor Isset Von's office ever fully explained, described it only as a routine discussion of compliance priorities among allied worlds. He retained his seat on the Compliance Directorate Oversight Committee for another 6 years, though 3 of the 5 delegates who had dined with him that evening quietly declined to attend the next several coalition gatherings he hosted, and the Velan Ministry's senior trade representative, who had said nothing at all during the original dinner and had voted with the coalition only because her government's shipping routes ran through Thren-controlled corridors, resigned her post the following spring, citing, in a brief public statement, a wish to represent her government's interests through channels less dependent on the goodwill of larger powers. News of the incident reached every one of the Assembly's 941 member worlds within days, and reached, in the months that followed, dozens of species entirely outside the Assembly's territory who had never had cause to think about humanity at all. Reyna received, through the mission's public correspondence office, thousands of messages from delegates and citizens of species she had never met and would in most cases never meet, some angry, some grateful, most simply curious, a handful openly resentful of what several called a new precedent no small species asked for. She read as many of them as she had time to read, and answered personally exactly one, a message from a 19-year-old junior aide on the Vantic delegation, one of the smallest and newest member worlds in the Assembly, who asked, in halting translated Terran, whether Earth's framework meant that the Vantic mission could build one too, or whether readiness like that was only available to species large enough to build fleets. Reyna thought about that question for 3 days before she answered it. You don't need 18 ships, she wrote back eventually. You need one thing we had that most small missions don't. Someone senior enough to believe, 6 years before it mattered, that the humiliation would come and that it was worth preparing an answer instead of an apology. That's not a fleet. That's a decision your government can make with the resources you already have. Start there. The rest is logistics. The Vantic aide wrote back within the hour, and Reyna kept the exchange, printed, absurdly, on actual paper, a habit her grandmother had taught her long before she'd ever imagined standing on a chamber floor 300 meters wide, in the same folder that held the flight logs and Deputy Coordinator Hess's original mediation request, because she had decided, somewhere in the week since the vote, that the folder's purpose had quietly changed. It was no longer only a record of what had been done to her. It had become, without her entirely planning it, a record of what had been built in response, proof, held physically in her own hands, that the space between an insult and an answer did not have to be empty if enough people decided early enough that it mattered to fill it. Admiral Kessler-Radami gave exactly one public statement on the events surrounding Contingency Framework Ashwood's activation, 11 days after the Forward Response Group returned to its staging point, in a brief appearance before a Joint Defense Council session that was, unusually for that body, open to a limited press pool. She did not, in that statement, take credit for the outcome. She spent most of her allotted time instead describing, in careful and occasionally uncomfortable detail, everything that had nearly gone wrong. The 9 seconds with the salvage vessel, the 11 minutes of live weapons lock above Assembly Prime, the malfunction that had nearly turned a diplomatic answer into the opening exchange of a war neither government had wanted. I built this framework because I believed, correctly, that someone would eventually test us the way Delegate Acaffer was tested, she told the assembled council. I did not build it perfectly. No framework survives first contact with an actual crisis without revealing gaps nobody anticipated in 6 years of tabletop exercises. We are alive to discuss those gaps today because a 90-year-old ambassador chose, in the moment it mattered most, to trust a fleet marshal she'd known since his infancy more than either of our militaries trusted each other. I would like this council to understand that clearly before it decides how much confidence to place in frameworks like this one going forward. Readiness bought us the chance to answer instead of apologize. It did not, on its own, prevent the closest call of my career. Both of those things are true, and I think this council does itself a disservice if it only remembers the one that makes for a better story. The council's response to her statement, beginning within the month, a slow and still ongoing process of revising Ashwood's operating doctrine to build in additional communication safeguards between Allied fleets during any future activation, never received the public attention the fleet's arrival above Assembly Prime had received, which Kessler-Radamy considered, privately, exactly as it should be. The dramatic parts of the story belong to Raina, to Isette Vaughn, to a young weapons officer who would spend a career trying to earn back the confidence a malfunctioning system had cost him in 11 seconds. The unglamorous work of closing the gaps that had nearly turned readiness into tragedy belonged, she believed, in a briefing room discussed by people whose job was precisely to make sure the next crisis had fewer places left for 9 seconds to matter as much as they had this time. Raina returned to the plenary floor 11 days later for an unrelated agricultural trade item and found that something in the chamber's attention toward her had changed in a way she found harder to describe than the 4 minutes on her knees had been, not deference exactly, and not fear, but a kind of careful, deliberate acknowledgement, delegate after delegate meeting her eyes across the floor rather than sliding past them, that she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. Ambassador Isette Vaughn found her again in the transit lounge afterward. "I owe you a correction," Isette said. "I told you 11 days ago that I was sorry and that it would not undo what had happened. I still believe that, but I did not expect when I said it that what happened to you would become the reason this assembly finally wrote a genuine consensus requirement into Statute 6's enforcement language, with teeth, rather than the requirement that existed on paper and that Speaker Corr simply chose to ignore. The amendment passed this morning. 411 years, and it took what was done to you to finally close that door." The Corvin's crest lifted slightly, the gesture, Raina now understood, that meant something like respect. "I do not say this to suggest the cost was worth it. I say it because I think you should know the door is closed, and that you closed it, and that it did not require a war to do so. Though I confess, Delegate Acaffer, I have rarely in 4 centuries seen a species come closer to one over a single afternoon and manage in the end not to need it." "We didn't come close to a war," Raina said. "We came close to a fight nobody wanted over something that should never have happened in the first place. There's a difference." 3 crew of the Amara Vos Roman II would likely tell you the distinction feels academic, Isette said, not unkindly. As I suspect, would the young weapons officer who has to live the rest of his career with what his hesitation nearly cost, and what his system's failure to warn him nearly cost more. I do not say that to diminish what you accomplished, Delegate Acaffer. I say it because I watched this assembly come within 11 minutes and one countermanded order of a war between 2 fleets that neither government wanted, over a chain of decisions that began with a dinner 3 weeks before you ever stood at that podium. And I think it would dishonor what very nearly happened to pretend the margin was wider than it was. Raina was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said. "I don't want to make it smaller than it was." I watched the casualty report before I recorded that statement. I made Okonkwo Baptiste show it to me, because I didn't think I had the right to speak for my government's readiness without knowing exactly what that readiness had already cost 3 people I'd never met. I think about that more than I think about the 4 minutes, if I'm honest. The 4 minutes were done to me. Those 3 sailors got hurt because of a decision that started with me, whether or not it was mine to make. She paused. I don't know what to do with that yet. I don't think I'm supposed to know yet. No, Issat agreed. I don't think you are. I have carried similar weight for parts of 4 centuries, Delegate Akafar, and I will tell you honestly that I have never entirely finished knowing what to do with it either. I have only learned to carry it without letting it decide everything I do afterward. That is the most useful thing I can offer you, and I offer it because I believe you will need it longer than you expect to. Raina thought about the marble floor. About 4 minutes and 12 seconds. About 18 vessels in quiet formation above a system that had never once, in 900 years, imagined it needed to look twice at a supply convoy. There has to be, she said. Otherwise none of it meant anything except that we won an argument by being ready to lose everything. I'd rather it meant we were ready and didn't have to prove it twice. Issat was quiet for a moment. A fair distinction, the ambassador said at last. I hope this assembly remembers it as clearly as you have stated it. I suspect it will not entirely, not for as long as it should. Institutions rarely learn a lesson as completely as the individuals who taught it to them. Then I suppose, Raina said, someone will have to keep teaching it. She walked back onto the plenary floor that afternoon without an escort, without a folder anyone could confiscate, and took her seat at the observer's rail among delegations that, for the first time in 14 months, did not look through her as though she were furniture. The frigate incident was gone from the record. Speaker Corps' chair had a new occupant, a moderate delegate from a mid-tier world who had voted, Raina had confirmed, in favor of the retroactive consensus finding. The amendment to Statute 6 sat, freshly ratified in the Assembly's charter, 4 words longer than it had been a week ago, by recorded majority consensus. None of it undid the 4 minutes. She understood that clearly, and she suspected she always would, in some small cold room at the back of her mind that would open, occasionally, for the rest of her life, onto cold marble and a voice she never identified. But the record was corrected. The door was closed. And somewhere 4 transit lane jumps away, 18 vessels sat quietly at a staging point, transponders dark, waiting for a trigger condition that, if the assembly had learned anything at all from the closest it had ever come to a war it never wanted, it would not need to meet again. In the 11 days between the retroactive vote and her return to the plenary floor, Raina had also finally answered the flood of correspondence the mission's public office had been holding for her. Not the thousands of messages from strangers across the assembly's territory, which she had not yet found the composure to face in bulk, but the smaller, more difficult stack. A message from her mother, 3 from colleagues she had trained alongside at the diplomatic academy, and 1, unexpectedly, from Deputy Coordinator Hess himself, the assembly official whose original mediation request had started the entire chain of events, and who had spent the intervening days, it turned out, watching the fallout with a guilt he had not been able to sit with silently. I filed that request because refugees needed a resupply run and your government answered fastest, Hess had written. I did not imagine when I filed it that it would become the pretext for what happened to you. I want you to know the request was real, was necessary, and was never in question in my own office's records, whatever the compliance directorate chose to claim about it. I am sorry it took a fleet in orbit for anyone to believe that. I should not have needed convincing that my own filed paperwork existed. None of us should have. Raina read it twice and answered with 4 lines that took her longer to compose than either the emergency floor statement or the private file she was still slowly building for herself. You didn't do anything wrong, Deputy Coordinator. You asked for help for people who needed it, and the help arrived. What happened afterward was never about your request. I don't blame you for any of it, and I'd like that on record somewhere, even if it's only this message." She did not receive a reply, but 3 weeks later, the mission's protocol office noted that Hess's own department had, on its own initiative and without any formal request from Earth's mission, begun cross-referencing every future compliance filing against its original correspondence log before allowing it to advance to a disciplinary docket. A small, unglamorous procedural fix that would never make it into any public account of the affair, and that Raina nonetheless considered privately one of the more meaningful outcomes of the entire ordeal. She saw Director Okonkwo Baptiste that same evening in his office rather than the secure briefing room, for the first time in 11 days that felt like something other than a crisis meeting. He had a bottle of something dark and earth-imported open on his desk, 2 glasses poured, and an expression she hadn't seen on him since before the vote, not relief exactly, but its distant, tired cousin. "I owe you an apology," he said, sliding one glass toward her. "Not for what happened on the floor, for what I asked you to do about it afterward. I put a 30-year-old woman in front of a recording pickup and asked her to speak for a fleet, and I told myself it was the right call because it was, strategically, the right call. But I want you to know I understood, the whole time, exactly how much I was asking, and I didn't have a better option to offer you instead." "You told me the truth about why it had to be me," Raina said. "That's more than most of the rest of that week gave me." "It's still not nothing what I asked." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." She turned the glass in her hand without drinking from it yet. "Can I ask you something you might not be able to answer?" "You can ask." "Did Geneva know, before any of this, before I ever walked into that chamber, that it would eventually be me? Not me specifically, but someone like me, junior, alone, easy to isolate at a podium with no one senior standing behind her?" Okonkwo Baptiste was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think anyone could have known it would be you," he said. "I think Admiral Kessler-Radami built a framework 6 years ago because she understood, with more clarity than most people in her position ever manage, that it was going to be someone, junior, alone, easy to isolate. That's not a prediction about you, Raina. That's a prediction about how power tests the people it thinks it can afford to test. She was right that it would happen. She had no way to know your name until the day it did." He looked at her steadily. "For what it's worth, and I understand it may not be worth very much," said after the fact, "I have worked in this service for 30 years, and I do not believe there is another junior attaché in this mission, or possibly in this entire government's diplomatic corps, who would have handled that podium the way you did. Not because you were braver than they would have been, because you were precise. You asked for a document. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't fold before you understood exactly what folding would cost you. That precision is the reason there's a corrected record today instead of a permanently downgraded mission status. I want you to hear that clearly, because I don't think you've let yourself hear it yet." Raina finally drank from the glass. It tasted like home, or close enough to home that the difference didn't matter that evening. "I keep waiting to feel like it was worth it," she said. "Not the outcome's good, I understand that intellectually. I mean the 4 minutes themselves. I keep waiting for some part of me to file them away as the price of something larger, the way you're describing it right now, and instead I just keep remembering the marble was cold, and a voice I never identified said I look small, and I don't know what to do with a memory that doesn't want to become a lesson." "I don't think it has to become a lesson," Okonkwo Baptiste said. "I think some things are allowed to just be what they were, cold marble, a cruel voice, 4 minutes that shouldn't have happened. You're allowed to let it stay that, Raina, even while everything around it turns into policy and precedent and amendments to a 900-year-old charter. The two things don't have to reconcile. You don't owe the marble a meaning just because the assembly ended up changing because of it." She thought about that for a long time after she left his office. Longer, in fact, than she had spent thinking about almost anything else in the 11 days since the vote. because it was the first thing anyone had said to her that didn't ask her to be anything other than a woman who had knelt on a cold floor and hadn't wanted to. She wrote, eventually, a longer account of the whole affair than the one the record kept, not for the mission, not for Geneva, not for any assembly inquiry, but for herself. In a private file she never showed anyone, including in the end her own grandmother. She wrote about the pin. She wrote about the 4 minutes in more detail than she had ever spoken aloud, because writing it down, she found, let her set it somewhere outside her own body for the length of time it took to read it back. She wrote about Isette Vaughn's crest lowering in the transit lounge, and about Okonkwo Baptiste's face in the arrivals bay, and about a fleet marshal's testimony she read 3 times because something in his admission, I responded to a shadow. I did not ask what had cast it, felt, to her, like the truest single sentence anyone had produced about the entire affair, on either side of it. She did not write, because she did not yet fully understand it herself, about the particular way the Assembly's attention toward her had changed after the retroactive vote, not into comfort, and not into safety, but into something more like the wary respect one power learns to extend to another once it has confirmed, at real cost, that the other power was never actually the smaller one it had assumed. She would come to understand that shift more fully in the years that followed, across a diplomatic career that took her, eventually, far beyond the junior attaché's desk she had occupied the day the stewards took her slate. But on the evening she closed the private file for the first time, she understood only that something in the chamber had recalibrated permanently around the fact of her, and that she had not asked for the recalibration and would carry the cost of it regardless. Raina Okafor kept the folder of testimony on her desk for the rest of her posting, exactly as it had been the day the stewards took it from her hands, not as a trophy and not as a warning, but as a plain reminder of the only lesson she ever really wanted the Assembly, or her own government or herself, to take from what had happened. That the space between one small act of contempt and a fleet in orbit was far narrower than anyone in that chamber had ever imagined, and that the only thing standing in it in the end had been a woman on her knees who refused to stay quiet, and a government that had believed her enough, long before it happened, to be ready.